Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being with us today for Transforming Pharma Through Digital Health. Before we begin, let's review some tips on how to engage in today's webinar. If at any point you're having technical problems, please feel free to email us at chesapeakedhx@jh.edu. That's chesapeakedhx@jh.edu. We like to keep our chat active, so feel free to share who you are, where you're from, your company, your LinkedIn URL, and any other useful information in the chat today. We'll reserve the last portion of today's program for question and answer, but feel free to either ask your questions directly in the chat or use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. We have moderators who will be feeding them up to me and the other speakers today. Within the Q&A feature, you can upvote questions you'd like to see answered, so feel free to use that as well. We'll do our best to get to everyone's questions today, but obviously time is our one constraint. Finally, the best mode for viewing today's webinar is in gallery mode, so that lets you see all the speakers simultaneously as we talk back and forth. Before we get to today's speakers, I'd like to have a poll to see who's in the audience. Digital health covers such a wide range of market segments and interests, so please respond. We're always interested in who obviously comes to these Anchor Ventures and CDHX events, but obviously we're also interested in seeing what your various aspects are. Jasmine, are we good? Should we proceed?
Have about 70% answered, so. All right.
Hospital pharmacist in the group as well. So now I'd briefly like to introduce our speakers, Sean Brusky and Chris Philippe. So first off, I'm Mark Kaminsky. I am the Program Director for the Chesapeake Digital Health Exchange here at Johns Hopkins, focused on improving the ecosystem for digital health startups in the Chesapeake region. We also have with us Sean Brusky, who's the Chief Commercial Officer at Pardes Biosciences. He was formerly with Genentech Roche. And then we also have Chris Philippe, who's an innovation technologist with AstraZeneca. Thanks, Chris and Sean, for being with us today.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
Great, thank you guys. So first off, I'd like you guys to introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your background. Sean, I know you may not be able to, in NDA land, you may not be able to comment on your former employer, but kind of what's your experience with digital health? What were you seeing in the pharma world? And obviously, Chris, you could talk in present tense with your experience with AstraZeneca. So Sean, you want to take it first?
Yeah, happy to. And thank you again for the opportunity to join this webinar. Yeah, I'm in this interesting transition period where I've just taken on a new role as Chief Commercial Officer at Pardes Biosciences. And the company is actually still in stealth mode, so I can't share too much about our immediate areas of focus, but at a high level, we're looking to transform the treatment of viral respiratory tract infections, including putting an end to the current pandemic and preventing the next one. So lots of digital health aspects to the commercial operation we're looking to build out here, but happy to speak to my 15 years of experience at Genentech Roche as well as we go through the Q&A. It's been an awesome experience.
Sean, briefly tell us kind of what's your background? Like, how did you get to this place in your career?
Yeah, thanks. I started as, an undergrad biochemist, enamored with the Human Genome Project back in the day, and joined Vertex Pharmaceuticals in the business development group early on in my career. Got my MBA, and then joined as a young marketer at Genentech about 15 years ago, and built my career at Genentech Roche in different commercial, managed care, account management, leadership, medical affairs roles over the years, all of which had a component of innovation and how we engage with the external world around what's next. And so that's definitely colored my experience as to the current landscape in digital health, and happy to share some of that as we speak.
That'd be great. Chris, tell us about your background. How did you get to this, and how did you get to AstraZeneca?
Yeah, so I've been at AstraZeneca for about 2 years now, and my background is a little bit different than Sean's there. I actually don't have any biochem, pharma background there. I kind of came out of university with the degrees in physics and Russian studies, which is an odd combination. But it really led me into sort of the innovation space. And I went over to telecom for a bit, did innovation there. I did that probably longer than I needed to be doing, but then that opened up an opportunity in healthcare where I went over to Kaiser Permanente and spent a couple of years there doing some innovation with them. And that led me over to AstraZeneca and the innovation space that we've got over here at AstraZeneca.
Yeah, I think you guys are interesting because Sean, you're coming from really the true pharma and science side. Chris, you're coming from really much more sort of the technical side. I don't know about the Russian stuff, but you're coming much more from the technology side. And I think that's one of the interesting overlaps of digital health is it's really kind of a combination of the software and the chemical and the sort of pharma chemical piece of this. Talk a little bit about what your companies, and I guess Sean, you can talk a little bit about either Genentech or generically what you're seeing in the pharma space. But how do your companies view digital health? Because it really is kind of coming from at least two disciplines, if not more. And then how are your companies using digital health to advance priorities and objectives?
Yeah, Chris, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. So what I would say from the AstraZeneca space is that, one of our core tenets is what we call patient centricity. We want to be doing what's right for the patients. And so when it comes to that, when we talk about digital health, the distinction is difficult between digital health and just health, to be honest. And so what we look at for the digital health solutions are honestly things that can go ahead over the long-term course of care with the patient to be of benefit there. One of the interesting things that I heard, and it's somewhat relevant here, maybe not completely relevant, but our CDIO, we're going through what we call digital transformation, and was asked, when will you know when it's finished? And she said, well, when you just start calling it transformation, we know that the digital isn't going to be as important. And I think it's that way with digital health too. I mean, when do we stop calling it digital health and just call it health? What is the difference between digital health and health? There isn't necessarily too much of a distinction for AstraZeneca, to be honest, because whatever can benefit the patient there, whether it's digital health, analog health, just whatever solutions that we can get there. Now, why would we be interested in it from the pharmaceutical space? And I know Sean can speak to this. There's usually several layers that are between the pharma company and the patients. You've got the HCPs or the hospitals, you've got the actual pharmacies, then you get down to the patients, and sometimes there's layers in between that. How can you get information from those patients? Well, in the past, it was pretty tricky. You could get them from clinical trials that you were running, but once it actually got in the hands of the patients, getting information from them was always a little bit tricky. And so wherever we have the opportunity to gain insight into what are pharmacies, what pharmaceuticals, what our drugs are doing, that's beneficial to us, it's beneficial to the patients, and we can help to improve the overall health by finding this stuff out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the mix of sort of bits, bytes, and chemistry here, it sounds like. So, Sean, you want to take a little bit?
No, you're absolutely right, Mark. I think the lines are blurring, and increasingly so in the last few years between bits, bytes, and chemistry. But what does digital health mean to a large pharma company is actually a really difficult question to answer, because depending on who you talk to within the large multinational conglomerate pharmaceutical healthcare organization, it means different things. I think for folks in research and early development, there's tremendous innovation happening in imaging and biomarker ID and target identification that's enabled by digital. They're in the clinical development arena. So much is happening to transform the way we approach clinical trials, leveraging digital health tools. I'm happy to speak to that a bit more from our experiences. In the market access arena, real world data, patient-reported outcomes, all are becoming more important. And then in the more traditional marketing, application of digital tools for patient engagement, for identifying reasons that patients discontinue therapy, ways to automate what are very manual processes today around benefits investigation, prior authorization, access to copay support programs. Digital is being applied in all of these areas. And I would say the area that's most interesting to me and some of the work that my teams at Genentech were involved in leading were, what is the future go-to-market model that actually, doesn't think about these things in discrete silos, but rather kind of creates an integrated platform for patient engagement in partnership with, leading health systems and providers and payers who are all in their own right rethinking, kind of what digital means to them. So it's a long-winded way of saying that there are many ways that big pharma are engaged in the digital health space, and depending on who you talk to within the organization, you're going to hear very different things about kind of what it means to them.
Yeah, it's been interesting to, I come from a software background. So, I've been watching technology and mobile technologies for, decades now. That's where this gray hair comes from. But, I think the thing that's interesting is how technology really has invaded everybody's life. I mean, we have smartwatches and we have wearables and we have iPhones and we have all this technology, but there's distinct parts of healthcare that have sort of resisted, for various reasons, have sort of resisted the technology, and now the technology is sort of seeping in. I thought, Chris, your comment was a good one. I'd actually be interested to have you talk further about this. But historically, particularly once the sort of advertising regulations went into effect, really pharma companies didn't have direct access to the consumer. It was like a multi-layered kind of attenuated experience. But now you all are using digital health in ways to actually directly communicate with the patients and understand their experience, with your pharmaceuticals and with their diseases. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you take a look at it, each market, each country is going to have its own rules and regulations, but it definitely is the case where this gives us an opportunity to be in direct contact with patients, depending upon what it is that we want to do and what the patients want to do, to be honest. I mean, we're not going to force ourselves into a situation where it's going to be detrimental, but at the same point, if we can go ahead and provide a distinct service to somebody, to provide them the ability to tell us what's going on so that we know better. And we can, move into things like perhaps you look at precision dosing. That's an interesting area that you can get into as you start to get to some of the stuff like Sean was talking about with patient recorded outcomes, or even just direct connections to them so that oh, look, we've got a person that has these particular indications, these particular biomarkers. If we cut the dose by half, it's going to be better off for them. Would we know this before? Probably not. And so those are some of the things that are interesting there. But I think, as Sean said, it really is, it's dependent on who you talk to. When you talk to some of the research scientists, when you talk to them about digital health, what they think about is the ability to go ahead and use something like virtual reality to model out things and move it around, move the molecules around so that they can see what the particular structures are going to look like and the potential impact that those changes are going to have.
Sean, talk a little bit, you've been in the industry long enough, talk a little bit about sort of this whole communication paradigm with the end customer and what you've seen has been sort of the evolution over the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, I think Chris kind of hit on it. We're at the early stages of this shift from kind of mass marketing, if you will, through standard channels and mass distribution and, how you bring therapies and the benefit of those therapies to patients, towards a much more personalized approach to diagnosis, treatment, and ultimately care. And I think what we saw over the last year and a half in particular was a massive acceleration in the strategic prioritization of digital health, brought on by the COVID pandemic, and what that did to recruiting patients to participate in clinical trials, what it did to being able to ensure continuity of treatment and care for patients, in the clinical setting, what it did to people's comfort with using telemedicine and at-home diagnostics and point of care. There's so much happening in that arena that I don't see us going back to the way it was before. A lot of those changes and the regulations actually that enabled some of those changes are likely here to stay. And every pharma company is kind of reimagining its strategy in light of those changes. How do we need to show up differently as a partner to health systems and providers and payers? How do we need to engage through some of these novel platforms, differently with patients? What new educational opportunities do some of these new channels present, for companies looking to engage directly with patients? And you've seen sort of a doubling down over the course of the year in decentralized clinical trial approaches, remote patient monitoring, tools that would enable us to, not only accelerate, the recruitment of patients into clinical studies, but to do so in a way that's just a better patient experience. And actually, is no longer simply through, a small network of clinical trial, sites and partners, but how do we think about integrating clinical research into clinical care, by leveraging digital health in a bigger way. And so I think we're just getting started there. There's some really interesting work. Companies like Science 37, my former colleagues at Genentech Roche just announced a decentralized trial with the Veterans Affairs Administration, looking at some of these digital tools in the clinical trial context. And so, yeah, I think we're just getting started here, but it's, it's opening up new ways to engage.
I think we just finished our Hexite Digital Health Accelerator a few weeks ago, and it was interesting to see how many teams came in focused on either using wearables to collect additional data and near real-time data in many cases, as well as using AI algorithms. And it really is this whole notion of, with things like wearables, you can get real data. It's not just self-reported. It's actually, there's a device that's actually collecting the data remotely. And obviously you got to have, accurate measurements and so forth. But then just the sheer quantity of data we're talking about. I mean, that's just a vast amount of data, much more so than I think, a straight up clinical trial might yield. But now you can have sort of longitudinal clinical trials, for lack of a better term. And then obviously the software algorithms, I think, are also amazing in this way because they can analyze vast quantities of data. I guess, Chris, are you seeing pharma companies basically recruiting outside technologists and bringing them in, or are they trying to grow their own sort of capabilities on these frontiers internally?
I think it's a combination of both, to be honest. When you take a look at the way that you're approaching things, I think that, there are some in-house capabilities that are there. And if you can grow that, then you grow that. And the skill sets that are out there in these emerging spaces, it can be relatively limited. The pool of people that you've got that are capable of doing some of the stuff that you need to do, the data scientists that are out there, the machine learning people that are out there, you don't always have the ability to grow that in-house, at which point you need to look to outside people. And so that's one of the interesting things that I get to do, is to take a look at do we build it or do we partner with somebody in order to go ahead and get into some of these spaces. And the answer really is always going to be dependent upon the use case and what you have available at your fingertips.
Yeah. I'll build on that. I think it creates some really interesting dynamics for digital health companies looking to engage with diversified, large healthcare, big pharma companies who often have competing in-house efforts and programs. And a lot of that work is sometimes siloed within certain parts of the organization. So being thoughtful about, who your customer is within big pharma and how your solutions might, intersect with, compete with, or complement, what a company's doing in-house is important. All big companies now have dedicated digital health groups. Some are thinking about it, as a resource to help with, the product development challenges, use cases they're facing. Others are thinking about how do they actually commercialize digital health or digital therapeutics as part of their portfolio of marketed products. And so understanding some of those dynamics are important, as you're navigating big pharma as a customer.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a number of companies. I mean, the FDA obviously is expressing its interest in this space. They've set up a center of excellence around digital health. I would say they're not entirely clear what they're doing there, but because it's obviously this big crossover between much more traditional science versus kind of software and algorithms, which is a sort of a different area of expertise there. And certainly, Sean, I know you said that, you know, all the big pharma guys are now investing in this space. You clearly have an advantage in understanding how to deal with the FDA. We have a lot of software startups who are coming to me and going, how do I deal with the FDA? And it's a big mystery. So I think that's a huge advantage for you guys. Talk a little bit about, you know, Sean, you started to say something that I'm curious about. How is the culture? Is it going to be one of these evolutionary things, like the digital guys are creeping in, their little component, and they're going to eventually sort of gain some standing amongst the scientists, the chemists and the scientists, or like, how does that culture work? I would say now. I mean, obviously, you're talking about some places they're thinking about it as a product, some places they're thinking about it as just a support group, basically, for the chemists.
It's, I mean, I can share my perspective. I think it's an evolution, you know, and depending on the group and the function, you know, in the company, folks are at different stages of embracing digital as core to their strategy and core to automating and evolving how they traditionally do their work. And where it's working really well, you have a very, you know, cohesive team, and, you know, digital has a seat at the table there, and you know, people who are looking externally at the state of the art and what's happening in AI and real world data sciences being integral to the development teams, I think is where you're starting to see some, you know, really good advances. And I'd say, you know, especially things like patient reported outcomes and other health economic measures, the companies that are integrating those really early on into clinical research and early development are much better positioned as they approach, you know, global market access and ultimately commercialization type activities. So it's yeah, it will continue to be an evolution, and I mean, people who span and have experience in both arenas and, you know, are really highly kind of valued, and how it's always been done versus what could be possible. But that sometimes when we're recruiting talent, those are unicorns, you know, to try to, you know, identify out there. And it's really, you know, folks with Chris's background that kind of come in and help us think differently about the way we've always done things and bring other industry analogs, you know, to bear on reinventing some of our long-held beliefs.
Yeah, Chris, I was going to say, I mean, among other things, this really sort of leveraging your Russian background, of course, but, you know, this really does sort of, I mean, this makes these global companies in some ways much more connected because the data can be much more connected internationally now. I mean, notwithstanding privacy concerns, I guess, but.
No, I mean, I think that that's definitely a valid point. And when you take a look at where we have come in the last 18 months, I think that it's been an influence on things. And there's been a realization that this very much is a globally connected community. And when you talk about things like digital for, say, just researching or for clinical trials, does it make sense to source everybody from a single cohort? Because it's typically who can have direct access to the clinics, right? But if you can expand that out through digital combinations and do some interesting things, I mean, looking at all sorts of ways to get connected to patients, you could potentially build out a cohort that has people in the US, it's got people in Central Africa, it's got people in Northern Europe, it's got people in Australia. And the diversity that's there can lead you to some interesting findings as you take a look at combining all of these people with diverse lifestyles, diverse backgrounds, diverse genetics, and then say, oh, well, this is why we found this out, instead of just relying on a whole bunch of people that live within 30 minutes of a US clinic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, go ahead, Sean.
Let's say one of the interesting dynamics that's still early in its evolution, you know, is how big companies think about portfolio prioritization and digital in the context of their investment decisions, you know, in R&D and otherwise, and, you know, thinking about novel digital therapeutics where the market opportunity isn't clearly defined. Big companies know how to monetize, you know, a new indication on a new drug or a therapeutic. And so when you weigh that against, so a more unknown, outcome benefit from a digital therapeutic? Is the reimbursement going to be there? Is the channel, and how is that going to be distributed? And yet we see smaller innovative companies and Pear Therapeutics and others doing really amazing things and reinventing, direct to employer, value propositions and engagement models, and sort of, inventing sort of the go-to-market around some of these new innovations. And so I grew up within a marketing and sales organization where it's, adoption, dose, duration, market share, those are the measures that drive overall sort of performance. And so a lot of people in pharma view digital health through that lens. How is this going to help me maximize, appropriate utilization, the patients who are benefiting, dose, duration, so we get the optimal benefit for patients? And unless you can draw a clear line between, your digital health app or, technology or tool and some of those measures that are driving brand performance, it's hard to kind of get people, to engage around the opportunity, even if what you're proposing could have an, dramatically even more impactful benefit on patient outcomes or cost savings for the system. It's just hard to think about it outside of the common drug, context.
Talk a little about, just review for people, like what is the major market focus for AstraZeneca? And I guess, publicly available information from Sean about Genentech, like what specific sort of pharma areas were you focused on, diagnoses or treatments and so forth? And then how are you all using digital health to sort of enhance that?
Yeah, so I think that, with the way that AstraZeneca is split up, we typically split things up into two different business units. We've got our oncology business unit, which is about half the portfolio, and then we've got our biopharma business, which is going to go ahead and cover your cardiovascular, cover renal, cover the pulmonary, some of the other ones that are out there, and that's the other half. And really, when we take a look at the way that things are going in there, it's pretty much the same thing that we've been talking about, honestly. If we're looking at it from the commercial perspective and how we can go ahead and best utilize that in the space, it is finding out how best patients can go ahead and use the products that we have developed. Almost all of the conditions that are treated by AstraZeneca pharmaceuticals are chronic conditions, to be honest. And so we want to make sure that we are doing what we can to manage those conditions. It helps us, it helps the patients. And so if we can get better data from the patients, if we can get better data from the clinical trials, if we can get more data, to be honest, and then do better job with the data through the digital capabilities, such as the imaging stuff that Sean was talking about earlier. Those are all ways that we can help to go ahead and ensure that the patients are being taken care of. And to be honest, if the patients are being taken care of, that will go ahead and help our bottom line.
And I'm happy to share, obviously, Genentech Roche, publicly available, operates across many different disease areas, tending to focus on specialty conditions with high unmet medical need, where innovative, personalized approaches driven by genomic biomarkers and others can help have a tremendous impact on patient outcomes. Oncology is an area of tremendous investment and focus, and increasingly neurology, autoimmune, ophthalmology, other areas, which I think are in earlier stages, but coming fast in this sort of personalized healthcare, genomically derived, therapeutic arena. And so the lens through which, a company looks at digital health in a chronic care arena versus looks at it in a specialty, therapeutic arena from a research development and commercial standpoint, have some notable, differences, but common themes.
No, that's great. We have a question from the audience. Can you talk about the role or the approach that traditional pharma takes to adapting to decentralized approaches by companies like Science 37? I guess, Sean, you know Science 37 pretty well. Can you?
Yeah, and I would say, this is an area which I think will continue to grow as a strategic focus for large companies, especially those that are operating in specialty disease areas where the patients that you hope to identify to participate in clinical research and development are often very hard to find because there's a rare, mutation, or, you're looking at a very specific, phenotype or set of clinical characteristics. And so you might have to screen tens of thousands of patients to identify the handful that might be eligible to participate in clinical research. And so taking a more decentralized approach and integrating clinical research into clinical practice in partnership with large integrated health systems and community provider networks, where you're casting a much wider net and you're leveraging the growing database of clinicogenomic data and electronic consents that patients have opted in to be identified as potentially eligible to participate in clinical research. I think we're just getting started with that flywheel, if you will, of enabling sort of a data-driven approach to decentralized clinical research and development. And there's huge value proposition to that, both for patients and having access to novel, innovative therapies closer to home or at home, even increasing, the access to clinical research, to diverse patient populations, to areas of the country that, we haven't been able to serve in that capacity is a huge value proposition. And then in terms of accelerating timelines, speeding up clinical trials, accelerating time, to market, sort of reimagining the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 process on the back of real world data is a huge source of investment and an untapped opportunity.
That was going to be one of the questions I was going to ask you guys was, where are you seeing sort of the intersection of genomics and precision medicine, but also privacy? Because obviously, and are patients and consumers willing to sort of give up this data, I guess, is one of the questions.
Yeah, it's a valid question. And then I think that what you can see, though, is that from a lot of the health data that people are willing to go ahead and provide already, just through things like Apple Watch, or going ahead and signing up for the what is it, the Me and 23 or
23andMe, yeah, 23andMe, yeah.
You're finding that people are more and more willing to share that if there's some benefit that they can receive from it. If you're just giving it up, you're not going to go ahead and just turn over your genome to somebody. But if there is some tangible thing that you can get out of it, then I think that people are pretty much willing to go ahead and provide this data out to entities that they feel that they can trust. And I think, to be honest, one of the things that just kind of struck me there was I had a conversation with a research scientist back in my old days. And what he said was, you really need to go ahead and in terms of privacy, you either need to consider yourself either completely willing to provide all information, or you just don't provide anything at all. This notion of semi-privacy doesn't really exist. You're crazy if you think you do, because you've got one of these things, these cell phones that are out there that can tell a whole bunch of data about you, and you're giving that away for free. Do you really, really need to go ahead and protect a lot of this other stuff? Maybe you do, and you do a good job of keeping that nailed down. But I think that for the most part, when you see the Apple Watches, the Fitbits, all of the other stuff that people are doing out there with just the general consumer healthcare devices, there's a market that's out there for it.
Yeah, I agree with all those points. And I'd say this is an area where some innovative digital health companies like Datavance, HealthVerity, others are making tremendous strides in addressing some of the privacy and interoperability challenges that exist, because data exists in all of these silos, across the very fragmented US healthcare system today. And so being able, in order to accelerate research and development and some of the use cases that we've been talking about, you need to be able to pull in clinical data, genomic data, claims data, EPRO data. And oftentimes these are collected by different tools or platforms, or exist locked up within the Epic or Cerner system at our research partners. And so being able to aggregate that and link it based on patient identifiers but then present that in a consolidated way for research and development uses for pharma that preserves privacy is a lot of the really innovative work that's happening right now, and it's continuing to evolve.
And I think one of the other things that a lot of people aren't aware of when it comes to the ability to utilize data is the advances that are being made in things like federated learning, where you're able to go ahead and run your algorithms against a data set and improve your algorithms against a data set without actually accessing the data set. You don't have to have the whole thing downloaded onto your network, your computer, in order to be able to do things with it. And so that capability right there, where you can even preserve some of the metadata so it doesn't have to be de-anonymized, or it doesn't have to be anonymized. It just is there for you, but you don't actually access it. These capabilities allow you to dig deeper into data sets that you previously wouldn't have had access to because of privacy concerns.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendous point. I think we saw last year, a year or two ago, as large tech companies started engaging with health systems, lots of articles and things come up about some of these concerns, which drove a lot of leading academic centers and health systems to think very carefully about their data strategy. And some of these federated approaches are enabling companies to partner with leading institutions like Johns Hopkins and behind the firewall. The data never needs to leave the confines of a secure environment within Hopkins in order to do collaborative research together in a robust way. And so that wasn't the case several years ago. You almost had to transfer the data around, which increases the risks of leak and security issues. Now a lot can be done sort of behind firewalls, behind clouds, within clouds. I'm not an expert, but there's a lot of cool stuff happening.
Clouds and clouds. Yeah, I was going to ask you guys if you were seeing a couple of questions. Are you seeing a lot of sort of inbound interest, particularly in the pharma space, from the Amazons and Googles and Microsofts and all those guys? Are they sort of floating around? I know they're aggressively going after health systems these days and research medical institutions.
I'm happy to speak to this. I am very bullish on some of those tech companies and the strategic moves they are making to be partners to industry in what I'm seeing most is in this sort of decentralized clinical research and development arena, some of the cloud-based technologies there, AWS, Microsoft, Google and others. I think they have a tremendous opportunity to reinvent care delivery as well in a much more consumer-centric way, and present some novel partnership opportunities for pharma who are willing to engage with them as partners in building that sort of direct-to-consumer channel, and tapping into those opportunities. Some great hire. Google announced today that Amy Abernathy is joining their organization at Verily, and it's strategic hires like that I think are going to help accelerate their success in really reshaping healthcare.
Yeah, and I think when you take a look at the way that it's evolving here from just the pure technology standpoint, those companies have the vision there that there are going to be a couple of key transformative technologies that we look at, not just in terms of digital health and healthcare delivery, but throughout our lives. Things like artificial intelligence, things like machine learning, things like augmented virtual reality, they're going to become ubiquitous most likely. And if they're not already playing in that space with the top pharma companies, with the top companies in general, then they have the potential there to have their market disrupted. And so I think that absolutely they're talking to everybody about those things.
Two other segments to me to keep an eye on, in addition to big tech, because I do think that there is disruption coming. Where it's going to come from, I think, is still an open debate. The other is leading integrated delivery networks and health systems like Hopkins and others are thinking about their digital strategy and how beyond, their immediate catchment area and hospitals and clinics and physician networks, how might they, cast a broader net for leveraging digital tools to bring the quality of, care to a broader population of patients, and obviously have a great reputation and brand and things to build from in that arena. The other is the large payer PBM organizations, which are increasingly vertically integrated and moving into retail and primary care clinics and really wanting to, have a fully integrated patient experience and link together all the disparate data sets across, you look at some of the strategic investments that, Cigna with MD Live, and you got, the retail strategy for CVS and Aetna as that's coming together. United Healthcare is clearly a leader with Optum in this arena as well. So, I think every organization is sort of reimagining their role in care delivery, that is enabled by this expansion in digital.
And I think one other point to that is that, we've been relatively US focused here, but when you take a look at the way that not just the big tech companies, but, how AstraZeneca is looking at things, how I'm sure Genentech, Roche is looking at things, when you have these abilities with digital health and you can expand them into underserved markets because the human resources are not necessarily there in order to take advantage of some of the things, that's a huge market and a huge difference maker right there.
Yeah, I think there's a big interest in sort of underserved markets, and certainly technology. It's funny, when I started my first company in 2001 versus a later company or even now, somebody said, "What do you have to spend all the money on?" And I said, in the old days, you had to raise the first $250,000 just to buy racks and servers and all that lunacy. And now the price of, first off, you can rent everything, and the price of technology is much cheaper. I mean, these smartphones now are down to a few $100s, a VR setup. Quest 2 is like $299 or something like that. So the ability to serve underserved markets with technology has become much more of an opportunity. So I think that's definitely a place to focus. Sean, you seem to have a big sort of lot of market moving stuff here. Where do you see the big innovations? Where, if we've got entrepreneurs, I think you said 17% of the audience is entrepreneurs. Where would you advise them to focus their efforts or look at things to do?
Well, crystal ball, so I've had the opportunity the last kind of year and a half to be on the receiving end of a lot of capabilities presentations from digital health companies seeking to, partner with pharma, monetize their platform, but not knowing exactly how to approach that. And, through what I kind of shared earlier, helping them understand the different stakeholders, the potential use cases that exist in different departments across pharma is one thing. I think we see a lot of spot solutions and technologies and really cool apps and ways to, that are out there and there's been this explosion as in funding and, number of digital health companies. The whole ecosystem is like quadrupled in the last few years. And so how do you cut through sort of the noise of that and, have a compelling proposition? And what I've advised, and this is always the chicken and egg, do you start with pharma to generate revenue and engagement and then kind of approach the clinical space? Or do you start with, a practice partner or a health system or someone who's, you build the user base and the that hands-on experience before then engaging pharma? And I actually think that latter approach is the right approach, because one of the first questions we ask at pharma is who's using your tool clinically? Because if nobody's using it, where's the data coming from? What is the value of what you're doing? And to the extent you can focus on how your technology integrates into clinical practice and actually helps to improve the patient experience and is user-friendly to nurses and pharmacists and physicians and people involved in the actual delivery of care, companies who've done that and have focused there in the early stages and built their momentum and, you know, been able to demonstrate that, have a much more compelling value proposition to pharma, because, you know, not only then are you bringing your technology and the data and, you know, to the table, but also potential clinical partners who are already using your tool, you know, who are, you know, shared customers with pharma. And so I think that's my big piece of advice there would be, you know, come prepared to speak about the clinical utility and the adoption and the clinical partners and your plan and approach to kind of growing that, because that's one of the first set of questions you'll likely get from pharma.
Yeah, and I would say from the view that I've seen with AstraZeneca, when it comes to anything that's being presented to us, some of the first questions are going to be, has it been cleared by the government organization? Is it FDA approved? Is it EU approved? I can't remember the EU clearances.
Same group.
But if it hasn't been, then it's really nearly impossible for it to be adopted by a big pharmaceutical company. Nobody wants to take that risk. But if you've got a clear vision of what it is that you want to do, and you operate in something like the software as a medical device arena, where you don't necessarily have as high of a bar to hurdle, because you don't necessarily want to be a diagnostic device, you want to be an information providing device, and you can provide that information to an entity that can then do the diagnoses, then you've got a value proposition that you can hit. You can get a clearance from the FDA, you can get the clearance from your governmental organizations that are out there. And then you've got a stronger value proposition to go ahead and provide to the large pharmas, because you can say, here's what we've got for clearances. Here's our clinically validated studies that prove that this stuff actually works, which is, you know, as Sean said, a huge thing. If you don't have those studies that say my X device is able to actually diagnose this, then you've got some challenges. But then if you've got the user base that's there from just the clinical practices that are out there, or even in the, you know, consumer health space, consumer health stuff can be adopted by big pharma and rolled out into some sort of a campaign, because if you're gathering data off of it, we might be interested in it. So if you've got that user base that's already established, that also gives you a pretty good avenue to bring it in.
Chris, are there any broad categories that are kind of on AstraZeneca's shopping list for digital health technologies that they're either working on, or looking for in the marketplace?
I think we've talked about this a little bit, and it is so varied, it is so wide, but anytime that you're talking about things that can go ahead and improve patient outcomes, there's going to be interest in it. Patient outcomes can be from anything from, reported outcomes that are not just the how do you feel today, but give you real data on it. It could be on something that's related to adherence. Adherence is a huge, huge issue for pharmaceuticals. And if you can help to improve adherence by 1%, that's enormous. How do you do that? Well, there might be a novel technology that is out there to help. Finding new patient groups that are out there for clinical trials, that's always important for the pharmaceutical companies that are out there. There's tons of ways that you can use digital in order to go ahead and improve things from the commercial space, from the R&D space. It's just finding the right approach to it.
How has, I guess here's a question from the audience. How are pharma digital centers engaging with clinical practitioners? And do you guys have a favorite example of a digital tool created by pharma that really made patient care better?
I can speak to some of the innovative work my former colleagues at Genentech Roche are doing in the MS arena, because this has been sort of publicly shared. But thinking about how you support patients, during their treatment continuum. You might receive an MS therapy once every 6 months, but how do you monitor that patient, and in between their, what could be long periods of time between when they see their neurologist. Some of that was developed in-house and in partnership with leading MS centers and UCSF and others. I think there's doing the clinical research and validation of those tools and how it not only improves the patient experience, but improves the ongoing management of care for those patients is a good example. I think we're seeing increasingly these companion diagnostic tools, remote monitoring. We published on a study that we were doing with the Fred Hutch around remote monitoring of oncology patients, using, pulse oximeter and temperature and dehydration levels, all things that would indicate, hey, this patient's having an acute event, maybe bring them in, get them hydrated, as opposed to having them show up in the hospital or the ER and having to get much more intensive, costly therapy. A lot of these tools have direct relevance in the context of value-based care and ensuring not only better patient outcomes, but at a lower cost to the system, some of which are being kind of developed in-house. Others we're partnering with, digital health and tech companies to put these integrated packages together.
Yeah, so the one that I can speak to that I think is kind of a novel solution is that what AstraZeneca has done over in China is that there's a relatively large issue with asthma over there. And so being able to have patients get in to see doctors or to see clinics in order to be diagnosed or to just understand what's going on, it was a bit of an issue. So we opened up basically pop-up booths that allowed people to go ahead and get in there and have the nebulizer stuff taken care of for them right then and there. It even got to the point where people were able to go in there with kids, and it got this neat little cartoon graphic-y thing done for them so that they didn't get freaked out about having this strange thing come around. So it was an interesting and novel approach, and it wasn't even branded AstraZeneca, to be honest. It was just a nebulizer clinic that was opened up, but because of the market that was there, it's that rising tide lifts all boats notion that we were taking in that market.
Yeah. One of the things the pandemic really catalyzed investment in was at-home and point-of-care diagnostic tools for COVID, and then broader sets of conditions. I think that trend is here to stay and opens up lots of really attractive kind of partnering use cases with pharma. The other being, the digitization of things that used to be destination diagnostics like MRI and CAT scans. We're starting to see mobile, versions of those. Echo is a stethoscope company that's doing some really innovative things. How do you think about the ongoing monitoring of patients in clinical trials, as well as then the commercial use cases of those in partnership with therapeutics, that address some underlying conditions? It creates really attractive opportunities.
You guys mentioned COVID and the whole pandemic, and it really sort of overnight we all were like, okay, we got to change the reimbursement model. Everybody's got to go to telemedicine, and for the most part, people adopted that and did well. And I think virtually every large health system I've heard presentations from, everybody just is assuming 20 to 25% of their revenue going forward for forever is going to be telemedicine in some fashion or other. In fact, some of the presentations I've seen, they're fearful that if their doctors don't, maintain a telemedicine presence, they will lose a whole cohort of patients. And so there is definitely some interesting part there. Part of that was driven by reimbursement. I mean, they sort of made parity on reimbursement. What do you, and that's obviously going to change somewhat, but there's still going to be a reimbursement for telemedicine visits. What do you think are some of those other things that are, those other barriers that are going to have to fall to kind of enable a lot more of this telemedicine? And where do you think this is all going to wind up in 3 to 5 years? Chris?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you're taking a look at is this whole notion of outcome-based pricing. And when you look at that portion of it, you need to have data that is giving you the validation that those outcomes are being achieved. And where do you get that data from? Well, you can't ask every patient that's taking your medicine to come into a clinic, to come into an HCP, report what's going on, get the data from them. You're going to need remote diagnostic tools that are there in order to say, yeah, the blood pressure is actually lower, and it's been lower now for 7 consecutive days, and it doesn't spike when we come into the CVS in order to go ahead and read it because we're really concerned about going out in public. Those are the things, that's one of the things that I think is going to be a pretty significant change with things, with the way that pharmaceuticals approach things and with the way that we need to embrace some of these digital tools.
Yeah, I think we're going to see continued vertical and horizontal consolidation in this space. We saw the combination of Teladoc and Livongo, recently Doctor on Demand and Grand Rounds, Cigna acquired MD Live. You know, there are other solutions like institution-specific solutions emerging, which makes it hard for pharma to pick one, you know, partner and navigate all of that. But I actually think the real innovation here is what's going to be the most consumer friendly, you know, approach. And you got some disruptive players out there, Hims and Rome and others are taking direct to consumer approaches where, you know, you can go from, you know, condition to diagnosis to prescription to home delivery in a way that sort of circumvents the existing channels and system. Who wants to go, you know, if you're sick, sit in an urgent care clinic and then, you know, wait for your prescription to be called into the pharmacy and then make another trip out to go pick up your medicine? All that's going to be driven by consumers, you know, choosing what the best solution is for their family. And that's where I think some of the big tech companies see a big opportunity to help reorganize the channel here a bit too.
Yeah, I will say that I think the interesting, you know, taking a tech perspective, the interesting thing is all the things that computer vision and, you know, remote sensors, if you take all that in, how much in person do we actually need, you know, to see a physician? And yes, one of the concerns of one of the presentations I heard about their concern about losing sort of the telemedicine patients is this notion that why do I want to go drive across town and sit in a waiting room, see somebody for 15 minutes, have them tell me, oh, here, all you need is this prescription, and then I have to do the whole thing in reverse when I could have just maybe done the whole thing online and they could have given the prescription anyway, and then I could just go to my drug
Yeah, and I mean,
drugstore.
part of it is how much of it do you actually get in a 15-minute slice of a person's life? If you can go ahead and see it 24/7, you're going to get a better representation there than what comes from it. And when you're talking to patients too, I mean, I think I remember it was the show House, right? It's patients lie. The thing about the monitoring devices is that it's really hard to get those to lie. You can get real data out of it.
Very good. Well, on that note, I think we will leave the patients alone for now, but yes, I appreciate you all being here. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Chris, for being with us today. And I really appreciate all your insights on this topic. I want a special thanks also to the Maryland Department of Commerce. They are a sponsor for this program and have been huge friends of all of us. I would also like to thank Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures and the University of Maryland, Baltimore for being sponsors with us in this program today. You can reach the presenters here today, Sean at partysbio.com and Chris at chris.philippe@astrazeneca.com. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all again. I believe we're going to make this recording available after the program, but it will probably take a few days for us to process and get it posted and so forth. Thanks again, Sean. Thanks again, Chris. Thanks again, everybody who attended, and we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.